I love your book. I've been rinsing out your blog for as long as I can remember to find out about lake monsters and other types of creatures for my research. And I just thought we could just have a chat about some of those things today. But perhaps we could just start with how you came to be there in this area, and what attracted you to this type of research.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I actually, it all began when I was a child, because I'm a native Argentine. I'm born and bred. I live in Buenos Aires City, and we used to go on holidays to Patagonia. We used to go on camping trips when I was a child. I was about 11 years old, and we go camping there. And it was my first encounter with mountains and forests and lakes, because Buenos Aires is in the Pampas. It's all a flat area, no mountains, no forests, just grasslands full of cows. And it was quite a surprise when I saw what the forests were. And then I started reading about it. I was only 11, but I thought, well, what's about Patagonia? I mean, we used to go trout fishing because the lakes are full of trout. And I thought, there's not many animals in these forests, because actually they aren't. You don't see anything. You see some birds, and perhaps if you're lucky, you'll see an otter every now and then. And I saw an article in a newspaper, in a daily paper in Buenos Aires, called La Prensa, and they published an article about this plesiosaur in Patagonia. I thought, plesiosaur? I mean, I was 11, but I knew the dinosaurs that died out years ago. So I read the article. I thought, what's this? I mean, this is it can't be true. But it woke me up. It arose my interest. And another thing that happened was that my great aunt, she passed away a long time ago. She lived in a ranch in the south of Buenos Aires province. And she told me this story about a piece of hide, a piece of furry skin and dung that had been found in a cave in Patagonia. This was in 1970. A dung from a prehistoric animal. That was quite surprising. So I started to read about these things, and then I read Chatwin's in Patagonia, which is a great story, and he brings up all these subjects one time and time again. The unicorn and the Mylodon cave, and I thought, well, this is interesting. So and then there's a lot of fairy tales in the newspapers and on the internet, and you read about them, and I thought, oh, so much, no facts, and a lot of this is like UFO. Well, now they're not called UFOs, the UAPs. No substance to this. I mean, somebody sees a ripple in a lake and they imagine they're seeing a monster. I mean, let's try to look at the facts. And well, the outcome of all that was reading a lot, researching, and my book.
Wow. I mean, it was very interesting to me, because, of course, being British and being located here, most of the lake monster stories that we get are, of course, related to Loch Ness and other places in the UK and the United States, particularly American and some Canadian stories. And it's strange, and I think it must be because of the language barrier, that these stories from South America, Central America, and other places, they just don't get out. They don't reach here. And it's strange to me, especially now in this global world that we're in. Why is it that we can't just, I mean, if I'm on your blog, I can easily hit translate if I want to read it in Spanish again and switch it back, or German, whatever I want to read it in. It's available. So why don't we do that? And then I started looking at your blog. I thought, wow, okay, this is an unexplored territory. This is one man in this place exploring all of these legends, and who's there with him. And of course, there was the past part of that with people like O'Nelly and others looking for the plesiosaur. And I thought maybe we'd start with that. Let's talk about Nahuelito and the history of that, and where we've come to now in its story.
Okay. Well, Nahuelito itself is a very, let's say, it has its roots in a Mapuche myth. The Mapuches have a lake creature which is called El Cuero, the hide, which resembles a manta ray with claws along its edges. and it appears in their legends and myths across northern Patagonia. The Mapuches lived in what is northern Patagonia in Chile and northern Patagonia in Argentina, on both sides of the Andes. Now, where this myth came from, I don't know, because in fact, there are no manta rays. In the rivers and lakes in Patagonia. You will find rays in the Paraná River, in the Amazon River, further north in temperate and tropical South America, but not in Patagonia. However, I found some reports that haven't managed to actually substantiate in literature that there are some rays that live in the Patagonian rivers. Now, probably the Mapuches saw some manta ray on the shore, on the coast of the Pacific Ocean in Chile, and this brought up this legend, and they built up on it, and they expected to have these strange creatures in the lakes in southern Patagonia. Now, Nahuelito itself is supposed to be some unknown lake monster that lives in Lake Nahuelhuapi. Now, Lake Nahuelhuapi is quite large. It's 550 square kilometers. It's about 120 kilometers. It's about 80 miles long and about 5 miles wide at its widest point. There's only one big city on it, Bariloche, with 100,000 inhabitants. And it's inside a national park, actually 2 national parks. So it's a well-protected environment. But I've fished in that lake for countless hours. We used to go fishing, trawling with my father. We'd get into the boat and go fishing all over the lake, in different parts of the lake. I've trekked the mountains around it. I've stood on the beaches. I've spent hours when I was in my early 20s during my summer holidays, reading books on the beaches there. And I only saw one thing in all these, I'd say 40, not 50 years of being in Patagonia. One thing that drew my attention, I was up above a mountain and I saw like a little wake on a crystal clear lake. I thought, what the heck is that? There must be some logical explanation. There's no boat. It's not the wake of any boat. It looks like there's something moving across. But I was at such a distance. It could have been anything. It could have been a bird. The lake was so calm. Now, other people, well, they see all sorts of creatures in the lake. But the question is, if there is an animal living in the lake in Nahuelhuapi, what does it eat? You could eat this trout in the lake, okay. But let's go back to the early 20s or the early 1900s. The trout weren't in the lake at that time because they were brought from the States and from Europe specifically to promote fishing. There's no native trout in South America. Like in New Zealand, there aren't trout either. They were placed there deliberately to promote tourism and fishing. And the local species were basically eaten up by the trout. The trout are predators, and they preyed on the local epuyén and on the local silversides and wiped them out. It's very, very rare to find one of these native species. And actually, this also altered the food chain because the local Patagonian otter ate these fish. And now it has to specialize in hunting or catching trout. Trout are faster, they're quicker, they're bigger. So that also put the otter, the nutria, as they call it here, in the endangered species list.
Wow.
So what sort of monster could live in the lake? So I spoke to a local and asked him, well, have you heard about this? He's also interested in the cryptozoological matters. And he said, look, it's probably not a carnivorous animal. It's a grazer. It eats the grass that grows on the shore. Well, that sounds interesting. And that sort of gave it a new focus because one always imagines these lake monsters as eating fish, preying on the local fish. But if it would be an animal that would come out of the water, like a hippopotamus, for instance, that eats grass, or a tapir, which is what I put forth in my book as a probable animal, that would be more logical. Now, there's been reported sightings of this animal, but all modern historic sightings in the lake start in the 1920s, more or less, contemporary with the Plesiosaur. Before that, if you go even before Argentina occupied Patagonia with a military expedition in the 1880s, if you go to the 1870s or even before that, there are some chronicles written by missionaries and by a Chilean explorer called Cox. They don't report any animals at all. They don't. They canoed. They paddled across the lake in canoes. They explored the area. Even Perito Moreno, who's one of the first explorers of the northern Patagonia in the 1870s, he didn't record either any lake monster. He recorded the myths about cave-dwelling beings, but no lake monster. So I think that Nahuelito was influenced by the plesiosaur of Epuyen Lake.
Okay. Because, and then that's one of the confusing things, I think, for outsiders. We often think of Lago Nahuel as the primary area where the plesiosaur legend came from. But as you said, it's more to do with the El Cuero. And the plesiosaur legend comes from different parts of the region. So can you tell us a little bit about other lake monsters in the region that do tend to have more of a plesiosaur-like appearance?
Okay. The plesiosaur itself came from a little, actually, I wouldn't even call it a lake. It's a pond.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably 200 yards by 200 yards. That's what it is. It's a tiny pond.
Oh, wow.
That's sometimes flooded by a river which flows next to it called Epuyen. Epuyen, by the way, is the name of a local fish in Patagonia. And this comes from Lake Epuyen. It runs in a circle, in a great curve, and ends up in the Pacific Ocean. So the Epuyen River, despite being on the Andes, it crosses the Andes through a deep cut and goes into the Pacific Ocean. So here's where the plesiosaur was seen by this Mr. Martin Sheffield in the 1920s. Now, Sheffield was he was an American. Mm-hmm. He was a cowboy. He came to Argentina in the in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He looked for gold. He was a gold panner, and he set up his little shack there with his family beside this river. And he was always there panning gold in the little different rivers around the area. This is at the edge of the Patagonian forest, about, I'd say, 100 miles south of Lake Nahuelhuapi. Okay, to get you where more or less where it is. And he had worked with Onelli during the boundary conflict with Chile. Both countries had set up groups which went measuring, sort of surveying the border and setting up exactly where all the features, the mountains, the rivers, the lakes were. And he worked as a local guide for Onelli. So that's where Onelli and Sheffield became acquainted.
Got it.
Okay. So Onelli, he traveled all across Patagonia, and he also promoted the plesiosaur legend. And it was, in fact, Martin Sheffield who wrote to Onelli, who at that time was the head of the Buenos Aires Zoo, saying, look, I've seen this strange creature. It looks like a plesiosaur. Okay, that's what he said. So Onelli, in 1922, this is 20 years after they'd been working together on the border, he set up an expedition to go and find and catch this plesiosaur. Now, at the same time, Nahuelhuapi National Park was being created. So perhaps there was some sort of effort to promote the Nahuelhuapi National Park at the same time. The fact is that they went there and they interviewed Onelli. And they couldn't interview Martin Sheffield because he was somewhere in the mountains and they couldn't find him. But they interviewed his family. Now, Martin Sheffield's daughter, many years later, when she was a very old lady I'd say in the 1990s, so this was 70 years later, she was an old lady, she recalled what had happened when she was a child. And she said that she saw the creature also, but it wasn't like a plesiosaur. And in the book I describe it, it was like a short-legged, furry creature that they saw it take, lying in the sun on the shore of Epuyen River. And that it passed near a cow, a carcass of a cow, and didn't try to eat it. So she guessed that it wasn't a carnivore, and that it was in the river with fish bubbling around it. Probably it was trying to eat some fish, or probably it was just swimming in the river. But her description is quite clear. She mentions the word belicito, which is like, a bit of hair. So she saw a furry creature. Now that opens up a whole world of possibilities. This isn't a reptile. This is it's a mammal, surely. It could be what? Platypus, for instance. I mean, why not? It could be anything. It could be any water aquatic creature, a large otter. There are large otters in the Amazon. So that's the story of the plesiosaur, very shortly, very briefly.
Well, I think it's really fascinating, and trying to research this myself, even with your wonderful blog, it really does jump around quite a lot. Now, of course, people mention the influence of Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World on the world, on the international scene at that time, and that definitely would have reached Argentina and Patagonia. And of course, that's cited for the the alleged plesiosaur-like appearance of Nessie very often. But
Yeah.
to me, looking at your blog, this area really seems to harbor a whole range of unusual looking creatures, and it doesn't surprise me, especially with some of these lakes having an outlet to the sea, or at least to river systems that connect with the sea, that there could be large unidentified creatures. Now, recently there was alleged footage of the Culebron in Branco Lake. I don't know if you saw that online. And there were two bits of footage. One in one of the rivers, I forget what the river is called now, connecting it to the sea, and where a very sort of, I suppose, serpentine, thick creature with a head sticking out of the water was seen turning and heading down the river, and another one in the middle of the lake. And that got a lot of people interested in that legend again. But as expected, and something that really surprised me was it turned out to be a sea lion had entered.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Now I just wondered about that possibility. Are there connecting river systems between these lakes in Patagonia and the sea that an adventurous sea lion, could enter and perhaps get lost and give a few unsuspecting witnesses a monstrous appearance from time to time.
I quite agree with you there. Yes, actually, if you look at if you read the legends of each place, each lake in Patagonia has its creature. Mm-hmm. Some are similar, others are different, but they all have some sort of a monster. Many are described as cattle, cows, or bulls, or horses. Mm-hmm. But the seal, or the sea lion, or the whatever type of sea creature you could imagine is a feasible possibility. Yes. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the creatures that were mentioned in the late 1800s by the explorers, you have, it started in 1870 with musters. Musters reported a creature living in one of the rivers called the River Sengel. He was the first to report it. Then Onelli reported several lake creatures. Ameghino reported the Yemish. All these are they're all mammals, though. They have claws and teeth, and they prey on animals. They're like tigers, the water tiger. I mean, those descriptions, they don't exactly coincide with what you'd imagine a seal to be. A seal is more in line with the Culebron, for instance, which is snake-like. But yes, the rivers in Patagonia, to get an idea of the geography, the Andean mountains run north to south. There's 100 kilometers to the coast of the Pacific Ocean on the west, and about 300 kilometers, 200 miles, to the Atlantic Ocean on the east. On the west, forests, deep forests. It rains 4 meters. That would be like 11 feet every year there. It's very rainy, very wet. And the rivers are short, and they run from the mountains to the Pacific. But as the glaciations of the last ice age cut across the Andes, some of the lakes that are on the eastern side, the moraines, the terminal moraines of the glaciers blocked their Atlantic shed, and they curve and go into the Pacific. So many lakes in Patagonia are easily accessible. About less than 200 miles upstream, you can get to these lakes. Others, on the other hand, have a long straight course across the steep. There's nothing there. It's shrubs, it's dry. They don't have any source of water other than the lakes and the snowmelt in the mountains. So you have all these rivers, the Colorado, which is a red river, the Rio Negro, which is a black river, the Chubut River, Sengel is an affluent of the Chubut River, Santa Cruz River. All these rivers go into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, yes, there's a possibility. I think I mentioned in my book of a freshwater seal, even like you have in Asia, that there's a freshwater seal, and a similarity in the name of an animal which is like the sea elephant, and a local Tehuelche name for this creature. So it is possible. It is possible because if you look at the Culebron is more associated with a snake. A snake is, they have a lot of myths with snakes, the Mapuche Indians. They have the feathered snake, the flying snake. They have all sorts of creatures associated with snakes. So you could also imagine that these come from, remember that all these native people in South America, they came from Bering across the strait, through North America, Central America, and then south into South America, perhaps in the Amazonian area where you have anacondas and large snakes also. some myths like this could have originated. You also see them in Peru. It's
That's
a
very
probably
interesting.
shared heritage of the South American natives. It's hard to say.
What kind of problems do you run into with your research when trying to dig beneath a coverall, catchphrase, or name that's given to something? You've mentioned this once or twice, and when I was studying the Yeti, I noticed that, and other creatures besides, there's often one name that's given to all large creatures in an area. What kind of trouble do you have sort of picking out the details that are surrounding these? And of course, archaic peoples or even peoples who are unused to certain types of animals will use something from their mental library. So you have a water bull, a water horse, etc. How do you pick through those superstitious and colloquial coverall catch-all terms to find the cryptid underneath? What techniques do you use?
Okay, well, as you say, it's not an easy task. The difficult part here is that most of the south of the Patagonian native people, they lost their lifestyle, and they were incorporated into the Western mainstream civilization in the early 1900s. So they lost their language. They used to be the Tehuelche people mostly, and the people in Tierra del Fuego Island. They used to be nomads. They had their tents, and they moved around on horseback, pitched up camp in different places, and lived like that until this was incorporated into Argentina, and they became, they worked on the ranches. They lost their culture, they lost their language, and they lost most of the traditions.
Yeah.
And most of them fell, they died because they had never been in contact with Western diseases like measles, the flu, tuberculosis. I mean, they died, but by the thousands. The Selknam people in Patagonia, in Tierra del Fuego Island, they were shot by the ranchers, the sheep farms. They hunted them to death. And the Yagans or Yamana people that lived in southern Tierra del Fuego, they were also wiped out by disease. So the only records that we have of their beliefs and the names that they gave the creatures are the ones that were picked up in these last days of these people by missionaries, mainly in Tierra del Fuego and southern Patagonia. The Catholic Church moved in and said, we're going to protect these people. We're going to bring them into these small communities, where it was worse because they dressed them in Western clothes, put them all together, and they all died of TB. That's what happened. And a few records of local people, like Bridges in Tierra del Fuego, who he lived with them, he knew their culture and their history, and they recorded the names of these creatures. So there you have a more or less phonetic name of these creatures and a description of them. So that also helps. And then you have, all these explorers that came across Patagonia when the fur was found in Mylodon Cave. Pritchard came from the UK, and he traveled all along Patagonia. He didn't find anything, but he recorded many of these stories. Even Musters, he recorded some of these legends and stories. But it's very difficult to go any deeper than that because there's no written records.
Okay.
There was a historian, he died a few years ago, Casamiquela. Casamiquela, he's not very loved by the Mapuche people because his position about the Mapuche is that they are not native to Argentina's Patagonia, but to Chile. Okay. And that the natives in Patagonia were the Tehuelche people. And he studied them in depth. He interviewed many old people who had memories from their childhood, and he recorded all these stories, and he pieced together many of the myths regarding El Engasin and Yemish and this sort of creature in his records. So you have to go there, and there's not much more than that, because nowadays Patagonia is not what it used to be 100 years ago.
Well, I was wondering about that actually, Austin, the cultural makeup of the composition of that area. Is it mostly now the descendants of Europeans and some others, or is there a remnant of the Mapuche and the other people? Sorry, I can't quite pronounce the second name. Tehuelche, sorry, Tehuelche.
Yeah.
I don't want to butcher that name. Is there a remnant of those people living on, or are they so mixed with the hodgepodge of Patagonian culture? And I understand there's some Welsh people there. I grew up in Wales.
Yes, definitely.
There's a Welsh speaking community too.
Yes.
What is the composition like? Are communities still very separate, or is everybody kind of mixed together?
Everybody's mixed together. Argentina is a melting pot. Migrants came from. Look at me. My family came from the UK in the 1880s. So
Wow.
it's a long time ago. Argentina is a real melting pot. People came from all over the world, mainly from Spain and Italy, but there's Germans, French, Russians, Chinese, whatever, all in Argentina. Now, the local Native Americans, the Argentine, the Indians, they have lived in Argentina for 20,000 years or 15,000 years. In the northern part of Argentina, the Spaniards, when they conquered this area and set up their empire, they used the natives to work in the mines, to work in the fields. They had a sort of enslaved system. It was I would say, indentured. Or like serfs. They had different names for this. And those that didn't die, because I'd say about 90% of all Native Americans in all America died due to diseases brought by the Europeans in the 1500s. But those that survived, they're here. You see any average Argentine, despite what you may read on the internet, everybody has a little touch of Native American blood. Now, when you go to Patagonia, that's a different story, because Patagonia was of no use to the Spaniards. It had no Indians that lived in Indians, as they called them, of course. The local Native Americans didn't live in settlements. They didn't cultivate the land. They didn't farm. They didn't have mines. So every time the Spanish went down the coast of Patagonia, there was nothing for them to do. There was no resources to exploit. They got to Tierra del Fuego. It was a bleak, rainy island, nothing there to interest them. All the southern coast of Chile, the similar situation. And they only stayed in Chiloé Island because, and this is an interesting point, when they conquered Chile, the Mapuche offered a lot of resistance. And they fought against the Spaniards until they managed to establish, they fought against the Spaniards and lost. So the Spaniards pushed them into Chiloé. And the Spaniards occupied what is now the area of the lakes, Los Lagos, in southern Chile, where Puerto Montt, Osorno, all these lakes that are usually mentioned with monsters are there. But after about 40 years, the Mapuche regrouped and destroyed all these settlements and pushed the Spaniards north of the Biobío River. Wow. So in the late 1500s, 1590s, they recovered their land there and they settled there. And at the same time, when the Spaniards had occupied that's when the Mapuche natives crossed the Andes into what is now Neuquén province in Argentina. And they established themselves there. Now, the Tehuelche people that lived in Patagonia, as I said, they were nomads. And they had a very difficult language to communicate effectively. The Mapuche language, apparently, I mean, I don't speak it. The Mapuche language is like Latin was in Europe in the time of the Romans, or like English is nowadays. It was a lingua franca. Everybody understood it, and they used it to trade with other tribes. So it spread all across Patagonia. In fact, the word Tehuelche is a Mapuche word. It calls their neighbors the coarse men, tough men, coarse men. That's the way they named the Patagonian guys. And the Puelche natives that lived in what is now Buenos Aires province were called Puel East Che people of the East. So the Mapuche language prevails in this part, but they're not originary from Patagonia. They came from Chile. Now, by the way, the Mapuche live in houses built with stones and thatched roofs, and they farmed. They grew potatoes and different crops, and they also domesticated the llama. The South American.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, they used to, and they also worked metals. So the Mapuche were very civilized people in comparison to the other guys who were Stone Age. There's a difference. Now, going back to that, when Patagonia was occupied military, both in Chile and in Argentina in the 1870s, this means both countries advanced on the Mapuche because the Mapuches also raided cattle in one part and sold it elsewhere. They were rustlers, and this couldn't go on for long. So in the end, the land was occupied, it was taken up, and the Mapuche was sort of placed in reservations or left where they were, and they had to work as laborers in the ranches. And they kept some of their culture, but they became like all the rest of Argentina, or in Chile as Chileans, they were assimilated into the Western culture. So they lost most of their culture. Now there's There's a new period in Chile where they're becoming militant and they're burning. They're trying to recover the national identity.
Cultural revival.
Yes, exactly. That's a good. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. There's some extremists, but I mean, it's a good cause. And since the 1970s onwards, they've been gaining more recognition in Argentina. Also, they've been given back some of their national heritage lands, and that. So it's positive. And their language is taught at some schools in the area where they live. So there's a revival of their culture of the Mapuche, but the rest were liquidated.
I mean, it's that. The end part is a very positive story, not the bit before, but it reminds me so much in some ways, of course, from the language perspective and cultural perspective of Wales. They had this revival in the last 30, 40 years where I was never taught Welsh in high school or even the formative school, but all of my nieces and nephews have had to do it from day one. I'm living in the capital city as well, where it wasn't very common. It's strange to see this culture come back into a main place, and perhaps that can happen for the Mapuche as well. That would be wonderful. I know there's not only lake monsters in Patagonia, and your book speaks about all kinds of creatures, but I was very curious about something called the Nahuelito pterosaur and other large birds like terror birds and other strange mysterious flying creatures. What can you tell us about those?
Okay, well, there must be some substance to this in a reality, let's say. During let's say until about 3 million years ago, South America was isolated from North America, and at that time, some birds grew to very large size, like you'd have with the moa in New Zealand. Okay, birds become large, and they become the prevailing predator in the territory. So these birds were larger than a man, and they had these beaks. You could imagine what's it called? Cassowary.
Cassowary, oh gosh.
Yes, okay. So you can, if you look at a cassowary nowadays, it's such a dangerous creature. You'd say a bird is dangerous. Okay, so imagine a thing that's like 9 feet tall.
Wow.
So these preyed upon the local mammals, and their remains were found in Patagonia. So it is very probable that, like the legends of the thunderbird in North America, the native people concocted some sort of myth out of these birds. In general, birds are not a very strong legendary creature in Patagonia, but yes, you do find them. You do find them. Mostly the dangerous creatures are, or they live in caves, or they live in the forest, or they live in the water as aquatic creatures. But yes, birds are also have this mystique, and it probably has to do with finding fossils. They came across this remains of a bird, and they, what's this? And they had to find some explanation. Regarding the other megafaunal creatures, I have no doubt that they met them in person. The Paleo-Indians were hunting gigantic glyptodons and hunting cave bears and hunting sloths. I mean, they wiped them out at the Ice Age, and the combination of human beings eliminated the megafaunal creatures. But birds, they became extinguished when the land bridge was reestablished between South America and North America about 3 million years ago. So they weren't contemporaneous with human beings. Contemporary, not contemporary.
And what is the fossil forebear of this giant bird in Patagonia and Argentina? Do you know what species it is?
I have it in
like book. I know in New Zealand they have the what is it called? Oh, I should remember. Now I was looking at this, and
New Zealand has several. New Zealand has several large. They had a large parrot, which was, and they had a gigantic eagle that used to hunt the moas. Now the moas were big.
Wow, moa.
So imagine an eagle that hunted. Yes. I can't remember the name of the species of eagle, but yes, there was a gigantic eagle in New Zealand. These terror birds are pterosaurs, 10 feet tall, and 500 kg, 1,000 pounds they weigh.
Okay, pterosaurs. Wow. Okay. Oh, it's taking me to a movie called Four Assassins. Never mind. I'll find it. I'll find it later. I just think it's it's just really. Is it? Do you think is it to do with now? You mentioned earlier that the culture has been extinguished, and essentially most of the legends and words about these creatures that we've inherited in the one world we've been inherited through the interpretation of European ears and eyes almost. Now, do you think there could be any link between some of the communities that came in to Patagonia and the legends that then sprung up? So I was thinking about the Welsh community, for example. In Wales, we have an Afanc, and of course in the UK, there are lots of Kelpie stories and lake monster and sea serpent stories of all shapes and sizes and descriptions. And it kind of reminded me of the proliferation of the Duende legend in not only Spain and Portugal, but in Brazil, South America, Central America, and this pizza effect almost. We export through colonization, through invasion, a legend or a similar legend to maybe to a local one to a foreign nation, and then 200 years later we get fed back this legend that's permeated the local culture. Could things like the Nahuelito, could it be based upon some of the myths and legends brought over by the European colonists?
Okay, the window that you mentioned is, yes, you find it in South America, but it's clearly originated in Europe.
Yes. Yeah.
I believe that most of the myths in Patagonia, however, are local. Mm-hmm. Now they're local and they're also imported, but from other parts of America. Mm-hmm. You have to think that the group of people that peopled America 15,000 years ago, they shared, originally it was a small group of people with shared culture and values. Mm-hmm. And they probably had these oral traditions that even probably go back to Asia. That's where they came from. Probably some Southeast Asian legend refers, and then the similarities, I mentioned them in my book, between Australian myths and South American myths. Perhaps we have it all hardwired in our brain as human beings to think about the same creatures in similar settings. I mean, we think snake dangerous, snake in water worse, because if you don't swim, and imagine a snake can swim, and so probably all human beings have this hardwired into our systems. And these legends came all the way from Alaska into southern South America, and they were adapted to the different environments, because there are many bull and cow legends and myths in South America, but there was no cattle in South America until the Spaniards arrived in the 1500s. So perhaps this refers to some wild horned creature in Asia. And if you go and you sort of say, well, but they learned about cows and bulls after the Spaniards arrived. And then this was, like you said, then this was rediscovered 200 years later. Look, they're talking about water bulls. But if you go to the Selknam natives and in the southern Tierra del Fuego, where they would never saw a bull or a cow ever, because there weren't any, and the Spaniards didn't even go near there, perhaps every now and then a ship, a whaling boat would go by and stop for fresh water. These guys had, and these photographs of these creatures with horns on their heads. So you say, where did they come up with this horned creature from? So perhaps cows or some horned being is something that they brought from Asia. Or there was, and I haven't found any evidence of any cow-like creature or bison or buffalo in South America, because the nearest creature that you have with horns is the buffalo in North America, the Great Plains, and some references in Central America, but none in South America. But who knows? I mean, always bear in mind that this is Latin America. It's a poor region. Archaeology and paleontology aren't funded. This isn't the States. So when they get some funds, people go to the safe things. They study the Inca, the Aztecs, the Maya. And if you're going to do a dig and you get to the depth of, well, this is the accepted date of human beings entering America 13,000 years ago, we're not going to dig any deeper.
That's right.
So now, only in the past, I'd say 3 years, as more evidence is appearing, people are sort of saying, hey, perhaps America was peopled 30,000 years ago. Why not? After all, the Ice Age It lasted
Exactly.
2 million years. So probably even Homo erectus could have crossed Bering a million years ago, or Neanderthals could have crossed 500,000 years ago, or the Denisovans 200,000 years ago. So now they're just beginning to find some evidence of some footsteps here in a lake in Nevada and in Mexico in a cave where they think there might be 30,000-year-old evidence of human action. So there's no real in-depth scientific investigation into an early origin of the Americans. So perhaps, as I said, there's probably horned creatures. They probably originated in America, but I believe they came from Asia. These are how could you say the deeply ingrained myth in
yeah,
the Native
absolutely.
Americans.
I suppose the description would have changed over time, through each passing down of that legend as those creatures were no longer existent to the local community, to the next descendant, to the next descendant, to the next descendant, until you have something that looks, could have been a water bull to start off with, and now is, an actual, water buffalo, and now is some strange creature that inhabits the lake and is rarely seen. So there's always that possibility. Now, apart from that, you talk about strange, out of place animals that are mentioned by local natives who never would have had the chance to see them. I noticed that you wrote about sightings, old sightings of something called the Patagonian hippo. I thought, wow, the Patagonian hippo, and even some of the sketches were quite amazing. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I was surprised because I was reading a book written by a Chilean naturalist called Molina, and he wrote this is the 1800s, in the early 1800s. He wrote about the natural history of Chile, and he mentioned the hippopotamus. I thought, a hippopotamus in southern Chile? Surely this guy would have known better. But that's the legend started there. And I remembered when I was a child. Jules Verne, one of his books was 2 years. I remember the name in Spanish. It was 2 años de vacaciones, 2 years vacation or something like that, 3 years holiday. That a group of young children and teenagers had been stranded on an island on the coast of southern Chile, and they saw a hippopotamus there. So I thought, I wonder where Jules Verne got this idea of a hippo in Patagonia from. And so there must be, and this goes back to what I was saying about the aquatic creature that is a grazing creature. It eats grass and eats aquatic plants. Perhaps there was some South American animal who not necessarily lived in the lake. It probably lives in the forest and is aquatic also, who's a herbivorous animal, and not necessarily a hippopotamus, but it could be either a tapir or a capybara. Now, the capybaras are, I don't know if you've seen, they're all over South America. They're like
a big favorite in our house. The kids love them. Yeah.
Yeah. They're rodents, actually. They got prominent teeth, and they live in here, 10 kilometers from home. During the pandemic, they appeared out of the islands because nobody was going around. The delta of the Paraná River is here close by. And they appeared in mass, and they were grazing in the gardens of the people who live by the rivers. So these animals are strong. They grow to be about, I'd say, 100 pounds. They're big, brown fur, reddish brown fur. And there was remains of an animal similar to them found near the Mylodon cave in Patagonia. Big ones. And so these are aquatic creatures also. It could be that these were mistaken or interpreted to be some sort of species like a hippopotamus. But the fact is that there are remains of these animals found, large rodent-like capybara creatures in Santa Cruz province. Now, if you go to Santa Cruz province now, it's arid, it's dry, but go back to the end of the Ice Age, when the ice was melting, it was more humid, the forest had a larger coverage area, and it was a different environment. So it probably had these sort of creatures there in that time.
Wow, it's astonishing to me, and especially the legends of the Mylodon and other creatures like that. The hope of, obviously, every cryptozoologist has the hope of current existence, don't they? The hope that some things could still be there, and I suppose from the perspective of somebody who's far away, it's easy to envisage in such a pristine environment that some animals could have escaped extinction, and that's a nice thing to consider. Now, one thing I'm concerned about, very much so, is wildman reports all around the world. They seem to be on every single continent except Antarctica. I wonder, does Patagonia have wildman reports?
Definitely, yes. There are all the different native cultures in Patagonia have their wild men.
Wow.
You know, hairy, aggressive, murderous.
Yeah.
They kidnap women, children. They rape women. All the things you can imagine. These are the wild men, and they're also quite primitive, by the way. So you'd sort of say, well, why do they all share this common heritage of a wild man? And that's when I started wondering, okay, what would a modern human being, modern in the sense of biological, but 15,000 years ago, when these human beings, Homo sapiens, entered South America, what did they actually find? Was there a pre-human, I mean, our cousins, the Neanderthals, or perhaps even the Homo erectus from Asia, did they come to America? Were they already here? And did they encounter the human beings who were arriving? And was there some sort of conflict between both groups, or peaceful coexistence that, like in Asia, led to the demise of these creatures, and we assimilated them? We have their part of their DNA in us. So perhaps this is an origin the origin of these myths. And you find them in Tierra del Fuego, people living in the dark forests who had to be, you were fearful of them. And even in northern Patagonia, which is an arid area, you have rock throwing creatures living in caves.
Wow. Okay.
And it's quite surprising that these myths, like you mentioned, they're all over the world. So perhaps it could be, as I mentioned before, it came from Asia. Oh, we met these guys over there in Asia, and we carry this story with us, and we tell it from generation to generation. Or we did find them in America, and they were here. There's some intriguing stories about sightings of, it's like the sort of the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot in North America.
Yeah.
Of contemporary sources say, hey, we saw a hairy monkey ape-like creature in the 1950s or the 1940s. And well, it is feasible, it is possible, no doubt, because as you mentioned, one hopes that in such a pristine environment like Patagonia, you'd be able to find these things. Now, as I said a while ago, it's changed a lot, not in the sense of cities. Only 2 million people live here. And Patagonia is the size of the UK, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, Denmark, all put together. So it's a big area, 2 million people.
Tiny population.
Yes, and the people live in cities that dot the coast. So you can drive 100 miles literally 100 miles in your car, and it's you on the highway and nothing else. Some wild animals, guanaco, cousins of the llamas. But then again, we altered the environment because human beings, the Western civilization brought trout, brought salmon. They even brought beavers from Canada to Tierra del Fuego to use them to create a pelt industry. And what happened? It didn't work. So you know what they did? Instead of killing the animals, they set them free.
Of course.
So in Tierra del Fuego, there's no predators, no pumas, no nothing, no wolves. The beavers are having a heck of a time. They're building their dams all over the place, flooding the forest. And now they've extended into southern South America. They left the island, crossed the Strait of Magellan, and they're beginning their colonization of South America.
Wow.
They also brought weasels of all animals, and they also set them free.
Bird killers.
So they kill the birds, they kill everything, and they're competing against the local animals who are in that same ecological niche. So it's complicated. There's an alteration in the environment, but the forest actually, and the forest also quite interested in South America. I've seen forests in Europe, and I've seen forests in Canada and the States, just to mention some. And the forests are more alive in the northern hemisphere, because you see squirrels, for instance, and the squirrels are just because the trees in the northern hemisphere, they have you have oaks, for instance, you have nut trees, you have different sort of seeds that the squirrels can live off. And then you have the whole chain onward. You have foxes that can eat the squirrels, and wolves, and you have more deer, also different types of deer. Patagonia, all you have is the puma, which is the American lion, the top of the chain. You have some foxes which eat mice. There's a lot of mice, rodents of different sizes in Patagonia, and you have the huemul, which is the only huemul, and the pudu, two deers. Pudu is tiny, 1 foot tall, and the huemul, which is very endangered. There's probably, I don't know, 2,000 left. They were hunted nearly to extinction. And that's it. There's nothing else. There's no bears, no moose, no elk. I mean, huemul, pudu. There's not such a diversity in mammals in South America.
And the llamas, the cousin of the llama that you mentioned as well.
Okay, the cousin of the llama lives on the arid Patagonian Mississippi, and they eat the dry bushes there. And they were also sort of pushed into, not into extinction, but they were the Patagonia when the Europeans arrived, said, "Well, what do we do with this now? Let's breed sheep." So they bred sheep. Now we know. They eat sheep and goats. They eat everything, and it started converting the shrubland into a desert. Yeah. So now there's a move to revive the guanaco, which is what the Tehuelche used to hunt. The guanaco, because you can eat it, and it has a wool which you can use to, well, it's a natural wool, and they're not so aggressive on the environment as sheep because they've coexisted in this environment for millions of years.
Now, I definitely would have to blame the Welsh people for the sheep. Of course, that's clearly their fault. I mean, nobody else can take that blame. I think there's something like 15 million sheep in Wales and just over 3.5 million people. So it's one of those crazy places. Now, in terms of that environment that's changed, obviously lots of animals are adaptable, but it's very sad to see, as we've seen over the last 200 years in many places, some animals just don't survive. One of the things I was interested in just before we sort of come to a close was the Camahueto, the Patagonian Unicorn. And that seems like a very interesting legend. Again, it's got other representatives around the world that have similar descriptions. What do you think that's based upon? Okay,
the Camahueto is very interesting. And I believe it's based on a one-horned huemul. As I said, the huemul is the deer that lives in the Patagonian forests. In fact, it appears on the national shield of Chile as one of the animals on their shield. So it's important to the culture in Chile, and not so much in Argentina, because most of the forests of Argentina are just on the border, but Chile has a deeply forested area. They're working hard to preserve this animal. Now, on some occasions, deer have one set of horns instead of two. I've seen photographs on the internet. Actually, it sort of looks like a unicorn. And another thing that's interesting is that this is also mentioned by Chatwin. He mentions a unicorn painted on a cave in Santa Cruz province. And I've seen representations of that unicorn, and I've seen others also. And yes, there's some reality to this myth. So the Camahueto, although taken to be something like a bull with teeth and that sort of stuff, that's a distortion of the unicorn, one-horned huemul, definitely. I mean, I don't have any doubts about that. So it's feasible. And huemul, you'd say, well, what is it doing in the water? Deer swim. I've seen a deer swim. I've seen him in the lake. I thought, what's it doing in the lake? And we were fishing with my father in Nahuelito Lake, where they introduced European red deer for hunting purposes. And I saw one swimming across an arm in the lake, which is about 1.5 miles wide. I thought, what? I mean, if I wouldn't have seen it, I wouldn't have believed.
But they're good swimmers. Yeah, they're very good swimmers.
Yeah. So definitely, this is a huemul with one horn, no doubt. And there's depictions of them in the rock art. I mean, no doubt.
It's good to have an answer. And I talk constantly on this podcast and then in some of my books as well about monster imposters. It's incumbent upon us in the cryptozoology community to eliminate all of the monster imposters that are known animals, which is more likely, it's more plausible in every situation, before we get onto the possibly fantastical concept or possibility of unknown animals being out there somewhere. But there is a part of me that does want it to be true. And of course, as a lake monster guy originally, Nahuelito, all of these other or the Patagonian Plesiosaur, that legend really sits with me. Now, personally, of course, you have to be balanced as a writer, but what's your take on some of these numerous plesiosaur-like animals in these Patagonian lakes? Do you think we're looking at a large monitor lizard of some kind that's outsized that we haven't discovered so far, or do you think there's a possibility of a prehistoric survivor inhabiting some of these waters?
Okay. I believe, yes, that there is a chance, very small perhaps, a chance that some megafaunal animal has survived until nowadays. Patagonia is enormous. The forests are great. I mean, it's a big area. Not many people live there. So there is a very slim chance that some megafaunal animal has survived until nowadays. There's a lot of, as I said, you have to sort of separate some sightings from others, because I've been told, oh, look, we saw this creature. And I said, it seems to be like a beaver. I hadn't thought about it. Near Puerto Natales, there are beavers. It looked like a beaver. Somebody mentioned the other day platypus in southern Chile. And I thought, platypus, a relict platypus, a monotreme in South America. I don't think so. This is probably a beaver, Yeah. It could be. But the plesiosaur isn't a reptile. It isn't a dead dinosaur. No. I mean, I remember when I was also intrigued by Nessie and Loch Ness. I read up everything I could about it. I thought it's very difficult for a dinosaur to survive until nowadays. It's too big. You'd see them. I mean, if they get a couple of these in a lake, you'd notice them there. They'd be there. But a large-sized otter, for instance, or even some tapirs that live in the mountains high up close to the snow line that come down to the lakes in winter, perhaps that's more feasible. So these are stories are based on real animals. There's no doubt about that. Behind every one of these native myths, there's a little nugget of reality that made it came into existence because of this, like perhaps seeing a manta ray or a sweetwater ray. Like I said, there's probably sweetwater rays in the lakes in Patagonia, originated the myth of the Cuero. But yes, I do believe that there is some animal, but it's very hard to see them, because imagine, I mean, when you're trekking along a pathway in the middle of nowhere, you make a lot of noise, and any animal that's, they'll run away. I mean, they don't want to have contact with human beings. Wemul, I haven't seen a wemul, although there's not many of them. I've never had the chance to see a wemul in the forest.
Wow.
They're very secretive creatures. And otters, Patagonian otters, I only got to see once. Once I saw, but I was very quiet, sitting on the riverbed, and suddenly the otter appeared. I'm so fortunate to see a Patagonian otter, and it was there frolicking in the water for a while, and it vanished.
Fantastic.
It was fun. But there's not many animals, because the forest isn't rich in food for the creatures. So you have limited quantity. But remember, in the Paleo-Indian period, 10,000 years ago, there was jaguars in Patagonia. Jaguars, and these are big predators, so they had to eat something.
I think, yes. I mean, clearly the ecology has changed over time, and clearly it's wonderful to think of these areas possibly hiding a few undiscovered animals at this point. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been really amazing. I will put the link to the book and your blog as well in the description to the interview. But in case anybody wants to get in touch with you to tell you about a sighting, or to ask a question, or even to support your work, how can they find you? How can they contact you?
You can share my email. It's austinwhittle@gmail.com. I will be very glad to answer. I have a correspondence with many people who read my blog, and it's always fun to share information and learn new things.
Wonderful. Austin, thank you very much. You've been great.
Oh, thank you, Andy. I've had a great time. I really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.